Hey folks, welcome to our second lecture for week 3, where we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about community-based climate action planning in the context of New York State, as well as right here in little old Hamilton, New York, in our town and village, and a climate group that I've been really involved with. It's kind of an interesting topic to see New York being a climate leader and having a lot of programs where New York is trying to be proactive as a state that really takes climate change seriously and says, hey, if there's not this action at the federal level and that we're not having our national government kind of be leaders, then we kind of have to take over and do it for ourselves. And this is obviously something that kind of ebbs and flows based on the different politics of our time. In recent years, of course, climate change has not been a serious priority for the federal level under the Trump administration. And so it kind of leaves a vacuum for states like New York and other states where you have more kind of a left-leaning leadership and politics that are interested in taking climate change seriously and having some kind of action around it. And how do you do that? How do you do that at a state level and kind of get something done, basically, even if you're not getting that support at the federal level? And so, in a way, you could say that that's kind of good because states can develop solutions that are maybe more targeted towards their region. What is the climate in their region? What are the specific issues? Obviously, New York and California are two states that have been very proactive leaders in terms of climate change planning and legislation, but they're pretty different in terms of the landscape and the climate and the resources and stuff like that. Whereas flooding is more of an issue in New York overall, fire, drought, things like that are more of an issue for California. That's a broad brush, but overall, maybe it's good if states can kind of do their own thing to some degree and really tailor programs that are targeted for where they are and who they are. At the same time, obviously, if there's a lack of coordination between the states, it means that you maybe have kind of a mishmash of programs and you don't have as much kind of joint effort and collaboration as you could have if you had an overarching kind of more centralized set of programs, legislation, and resources that would help support them all, including maybe tax dollars that would be funneled down from the federal level. Now, we do have this to some degree, obviously, with the EPA and other national level programs that provide support. But again, that kind of like goes a little bit back and forth depending on who the leadership is at the national level and whether they want to support those issues or they want to resist them or even in some cases override them and say, hey, we're the feds and our rules, our legislation takes priority. And so they would kind of try to basically kind of stomp out or restrict the ability of states to set their own agenda in terms of climate planning, but even things like we've seen examples with regulations about gas mileage and stuff like that, where the federal level has been trying to kind of impact the role of states and how much say that they can have about those types of issues and regulations in their own state. So as we said, there's kind of a patchwork of programs across the U.S., including here in New York. We have some cool programs that I'm going to talk about more in this lecture today, but it does mean that there's some variation from state to state, even though the states do themselves on their own have some collaboration and some cross-coordination about those programs. One thing to kind of point out for New York as part of our leadership in terms of climate, New York passed last year under the Cuomo administration a pretty aggressive set of climate commitments under this law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, CLCPA. And one of the main the main goals that it sets is to try to achieve carbon neutrality as a state by 2040 and having a really aggressive kind of timeline in that regard. So 2040 maybe sounds kind of far away, but imagine, the millions of people in New York State, all the different communities, all the different businesses and so forth trying to steer that towards carbon neutrality by 2040. It's a pretty big goal to try to get there. In support of that goal, there's a number of programs that are available. We're going to talk about a couple of them in a moment here, and I've asked you to look at the Climate Smart Communities website in preparation for class today. But before we get there, just a little bit of background on some of the jargon and some of the terminology that we come across when we deal with questions of climate change planning, especially kind of at a community level. One of those terms we have is, of course, greenhouse gas emissions, and a lot of you are familiar with that, but I think the thing to emphasize there, as we have done in class, is that CO2 is not the only greenhouse gas. Methane and other things that are emitted into the air do also have really strong and powerful effects in terms of the greenhouse effect, and we need to count those. And so that's why we have this MTE CO2, metric tons equivalent of CO2, is a figure that we often reference because it helps to kind of put everything under the same standard of CO2, even if it's not all CO2. And then there's some terms about the types of research that we need to do in order to do the work of climate planning. And one of those is climate mitigation. In other words, trying to reduce the overall carbon or emissions footprint that we have as a community, and then climate adaptation and resilience. That's thinking that, well, if climate change is already happening, it's already here, we're already feeling the effects, we'll feel even more of them in the future, we really need to start preparing and adapting to a changing world. And so resiliency plans and adaptation plans are, in a sense, an admission that climate change is something we can't dial back entirely, and that we need to do work to try to plan for how to take it into account in our lives. Related to that, climate vulnerability and justice is a key issue there, because we know that those impacts, if we do admit that they're here and they're coming in a more intense way in the future, are going to have disproportionate impacts in our community. Some people are going to be hit harder by them than others, and so we really have to identify and include, give a voice to those people who are going to be most vulnerable to them, and find ways to mitigate and adapt to those risks so that we're kind of bringing everybody along, and that we don't have some people who are protected and some people who aren't in terms of the effects of climate change. Finally, the way that we wrap all this up into a kind of a comprehensive plan is to develop a CAP, or a climate action plan. And so a community like Hamilton or an institution like Colgate can develop their climate action plan. We already saw the bicentennial plan that Colgate developed, and Hamilton, the town and village, are working on a joint plan themselves right now that helps say, okay, how do we take all this research, all this planning, all these objectives that we have into account, and put them in a master plan that helps the community say, okay, over the course of 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, whatever your timeline is for sustainability, how do we really outline the goals that we have, the resources we need to achieve them, and the plans that we'll put in place to get that work done. So the larger state context then, at least part of it, for the work that we're doing here in Hamilton, and I think will be an important part of some of your projects for this course, is New York's Climate Smart Communities program. This is an attempt by New York to try to do something at a state level and incentivize municipalities like the town and village of Hamilton, but really communities all over the state, to do their own climate planning and to develop initiatives that will help them to achieve climate smartness. And we'll talk a little bit more both in this lecture and class of kind of about what that means and what the process is. But overall, it's a program that is administered through New York's Department of Environmental Conservation, which is a state level kind of EPA type organization that does a lot of stuff with conservation. So it includes things like fishing and hunting and stuff like that, but also these types of programs. And it supports New York communities in the efforts that they have for doing climate planning, including all the stuff on the previous page: inventorying, climate planning, developing vulnerability studies, stuff like that. So communities adopt this 10-point pledge that acknowledges the existence of climate change and its coming impacts, and says that they'll do a number of things to try to achieve climate smart community certification, and more generally to get their communities ready for the impacts of climate change and do work to mitigate it. After the adoption of that pledge, essentially what you do is you try to submit documentation for a range of different programs, and that's something, again, you'll see on the website, and I'll show you on the next slide, where you try to gain points. So this sound familiar? Similar to how we talked about the ASHE STARS program, LEED certification for new buildings, sustainable buildings. These are all ways that you can kind of document and score points so that you can get a bronze certification for 120 points. You can get a silver certification as a climate smart community at 300 points. And yay, so far we're kind of getting there. Madison County was the first municipality in our region to be certified back in 2017. And just recently, a few months ago, earlier this year, both the town and the village of Hamilton also were certified bronze climate smart communities. So we're in one of the first areas in the state where we have both a town, a village, and a county that together are all certified as part of this program. This is just a screenshot from the Climate Smart Communities website. You'll see this picture when you first jump onto their page, but you can see all the different communities around the state on this map that have either taken that pledge, in other words, adopted a resolution as a municipality to say, yes, we sign on for this program, or who've achieved certification. Up here it shows you the numbers for all those. Over 300 communities have said, yes, we sign on, but only 51 so far. I guess about 1/6 of those have actually been certified either bronze or silver, including our communities here in Hamilton and in Madison County. And over here on the left, you can see all the different broad categories of actions that you can get points for. So there are things like doing inventories, you can see, for your emissions in number 2, doing things like in 3, 4, 5 to kind of keep track of the materials and the energy that you're using and trying to make those as kind of green as possible and reducing emissions. And then 6, 7, 8, 9, those are things related to land use, communication with the public, business development and green businesses, stuff like that. And then some other things related to innovative actions and performance. In other words, like say you implement a solar program on one of your village buildings or a county building, you could get points for that action. So there's a lot of different ways to get points, but it all is kind of based around that kind of planning, that kind of action to add up the points and show that you've actually been doing the work to gain certification. In the context of Hamilton, we developed a working group a few years ago to try to coordinate this work. It's not just for climate smart communities, but that's been a big part of our effort so far. And actually students in ENST 390, including you all this semester, have been a huge help for this group and the work that we've done, including the effort to try to get certified earlier this year as a bronze climate smart community. So good job, ENST 390 students. You've been a real great source of support and partners in this effort. But the working group is one that is a partnership mainly between the town and the village to try to do the kind of work that we've been talking about in this prior slides. And it's been meeting since 2016 to discuss climate change planning and preparedness. And overall, I won't read this whole mission statement, but you can see that one of the key things that our focus that the group is focused on is working to identify people and resources who are especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So there's a really, ideally, a strong kind of climate justice and climate vulnerability component to the work of the group. And that's something that some of the groups you'll be working on really closely this semester. And so you can help us to kind of do a better job of that, ideally, through the research and the planning that you're going to do. The key representatives for the group include, as I said before, folks in the town and village who are the elected officials or appointed officials in a lot of cases, like town managers and people who work for the public works and utilities and stuff like that. People in the Madison County Planning Office. Again, some of you are partnered with Stefan Lutter from that office. Our Partnership for Community Development here in Hamilton. The Business Alliance, which is an allied group with the PCD, our Central School, Cornell Cooperative Extension that helps us connect to the agricultural community, Colgate, of course, and especially our Sustainability Office and the Program in Environmental Studies. And then there's a number of community members who've been appointed just as kind of at-large community members with interests in these topics who can help give us the community perspective and are appointed by the elected officials from the town and the village. The group has also been involved with a lot of outreach to community members who are outside of the group, and over the last couple of years we've had a lot of public meetings where we tried to draw people in and get people's input about climate change. What do they think about it? Are they concerned about it? If they're concerned about it, what are their concerns? Do they have specific things that they think we should be working on and that are really important to them? And so as part of that process, we actually developed kind of a fill-in-the-blank interview that you can do at one meeting where we asked all the participants to help us by filling in blanks about Hamilton in 2030 as kind of a vision process. In 2030, you want Hamilton to be what? You want the energy system to be what? The infrastructure to be what? The food system to be fill in the blank. So all those things, we kind of asked people to give us some thoughts, and then we tallied up all the responses and had a discussion about a follow-up discussion to help people kind of give us a little bit more context about why they put things in those blanks. And overall, what the community members who were at this meeting helped us develop was that in 2030, they hoped Hamilton would be a model community. In other words, that Hamilton would be able to provide leadership for other communities like us in New York State, whether they're around here or further away, or maybe even out of state, more of a national model in some ways for a small college town in a rural area. That our energy system would be carbon neutral, that we would move away from fossil fuels, based in a multimodal transportation infrastructure. In other words, there'd be a lot of ways to get around, and that maybe overall we'd be less car-based, that it would be easier to walk around, easier to bike around, stuff like that. And then we'd have a food system that was supporting local producers in our region, and that it's community driven. That's really based on trying to engage community producers and community eaters to get them together. So overall, I think you can see that this process is really meant to have a strong component of community engagement at the center of it, so that we would really listen and learn from the community, as we've been talking about in class, to develop priorities to work on, and then try to follow through those on initiatives that would not only help us get certified, but really to do the work of climate preparedness and planning through this process of exchange. So to conclude, as always, a few discussion questions, and these are ones that I mentioned in class earlier this week, so this is no surprise to you, but overall it's focused on my assignment to you of looking at the Climate Smart Communities website and just kind of seeing what are the dimensions of sustainability or community that you see represented in the different initiatives that communities can take on through Climate Smart Communities program. What's the scope of them? Big or small, easy or hard, things like that. And is it seem like there are some projects that are especially suited for the CBR type of approach that we've talked about in class? Where is community engagement? Where does the community get a chance to say, how is that built into the process? And even more specifically, how do you see it being part of your projects and the community-based methods that you're going to be using to achieve your project goals and writing your report? So we'll talk about that more in class, and I'll see you then.